to stream.
Yeah, there we are.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, we appear to be live now, so welcome to all who are joining in for the meeting of the Finance Committee today, Tuesday, May the 4th. I'll call the meeting to order and look to have the agenda approved. Are there any changes to the agenda?
There are none from administration.
In which case, I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? And opposed? Agenda is approved. We'll go right to item D1, the 2020 Administrative Financial Report. And I'll ask Ms. Richardson to take the mic.
Good afternoon. I'm just going to pull up my presentation here. Hopefully that was it for technical issues for the day. And swap these there. Hopefully you're seeing the right screen now.
You should never say those things out loud.
Knocking on wood here off camera. So for the first agenda item this afternoon, I'll cover the 2020 operating results, touch briefly on capital, and then conclude with our recommendation regarding the surplus. So as we have highlighted in prior years, and sorry, I know this is really small on the screen, but it does form attachment 1 to the first agenda item in both the digital and print packages. So as we've highlighted in prior years, the audited statements are prepared in accordance with public sector accounting principles and are really quite different in presentation than our internal statements, which are really focused around determining the municipal tax requirement. It's all the same information, it's just presented really quite differently for those two purposes. This bridge I have on screen forms the connector between the two, how we go from our internal operating surplus to how we report our financials and the number presented in the financial statements that were approved a couple weeks back. The starting point for the bridge is the surplus per our internal statements, and it's consistent with the summary of all the units you have in attachment number 2 at 1.3 million. We then add back several items. Internally, we treat our transfers to reserves like an expense, and that is money we are setting aside for future use. We also add back capital revenues as those aren't considered in our operating revenues. And finally, we add back the debenture principal, which we treat as an expense, the whole debenture payments. We treat as an expense in our internal statements, but the principal portion is not an expense in our external statements. Then we subtract several items. So similar to the transfers to reserves above, we remove transfers from reserves. We also subtract non-TCA expenditures. So when we talk about our town capital projects, it does often include things like plans and studies that have a multi-year benefit, but don't meet the TCA criteria of an asset. So we reduce those expenditures from our internal surplus. We also don't include amortization in our internal statements, so we subtract that. And finally, we remove any loss or gain on disposal of TCA assets. We then end at the excess of revenue over expenses per our non-consolidated audited statements. And then we add the surplus of our consolidated entities. So we end at the excess of revenue over expenses for 2020 per our consolidated statements that were presented again there at the last meeting at 5.5 million. So as I said, our surplus that we use for our internal purposes for 2020 was 1.3 million, which represents approximately 2.5% of total annual expenditures of 53.8 million. Given municipalities are not permitted to budget deficits and the tumultuous nature of 2020, given the impacts of COVID-19, we believe this to be a reasonable result. So 2020 was not the year any of us necessarily expected going into it with the emergence of the COVID pandemic early in the year. While the budget was amended to reduce reserve contributions in order to reduce taxes, other impacts were anticipated but were to be managed within the budget. The most material financial impact of COVID-19 was the lost recreation revenues due to facility closures and restrictions. This totaled 2.6 million. There were some offsetting expenditure reductions, unfortunately including layoffs, which totaled 1.1 million. There were also offsetting expenditure reductions on the facilities side, As a result of these closures, again, which did include layoffs, and those expenditure reductions totaled $312,000. This means that for every dollar we didn't spend as a result of the closures, we were losing almost $2 in revenue. In order to address this shortfall, savings in salaries, wages, and benefits in areas other than recreation facilities totaled $723,000, which included delays in filling new positions, and savings in admin and general expenses, contracted services, and supplies and energy from all other areas were sought for a total of $674,000. Additionally, with the receipt of the most grant funding in the latter portion of the year, the amount of money left in the operating budget to cover COVID expenses for the last part of the year exceeded the actual COVID expenses we incurred in that last part of the year. Finally, both due to actively trying to reduce expenses and also due to the response to COVID limiting our capacity to otherwise take on planned work, $516,000 in carryovers from 2019 were unused or returned. So outside of those main items, all other ins and outs across the town totaled $430,000, which is how we arrive in total at our $1.3 million of our internal surplus. So that's the level of detail I was going to walk through for today's presentation, but further details by roll-up with additional comments were included in the package as that second attachment. So if there are any questions from members of the Finance Committee on those results, I'm happy to take those at this time before we move on to capital.
I'm looking to see if there's any questions for Ms. Richardson on this information. I see none.
Okay, so included in attachment 3 were all the projects budgeted for 2020, which does include previous year projects that were still in progress and carried into 2020. This includes the spending, the budget, where the funding came from, as well as the project status. Also included are schedules of reserves and deferred revenue, which shows transfers in and out, including the usage of those funds and the ending balance. So any questions on those capital, the 2020 capital sheets that were included as attachment 3? Otherwise, I'll move on to the surplus allocation.
Give me a sec here. I think I
Sure.
had a couple of questions. So that's in regards to attachment 3. You're asking the closeout sheets?
I think the closeout sheets are the next agenda.
All right. Yeah, right.
Yep,
Get
so that one's the
ahead of
more
myself.
kind of fulsome one.
Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. So proceed.
Okay, perfect. So next I was going to speak to the surplus allocation. So our recommendation regarding the allocation of the surplus is as laid out here. So we're recommending $197,000 go to the tax stabilization reserve. And as you would have seen on the previous slide, that was that excess of grant money over the COVID expenses for the final part of the year. So what we're recommending is that that difference go to the tax stabilization reserve, where the rest of that grant money went in order to cover future COVID costs. Next, we're recommending $500,000 go to the general capital reserve. So the first $250,000 of that would be to replace the reserve contribution reduction we made to reduce the 2021 tax requirement. So as the Finance Committee may recall, we were aware that we were projecting a surplus at the time of the final budget deliberation. So we're recommending those reserve transfers that we removed at budget time be replaced with the surplus allocation. So $250,000 is to replace that. We're recommending an additional $250,000 to the general capital reserve in order to support our capital program. There are a number of significant capital projects identified in our 5-year capital plan. And with the recent provincial budget, we're also aware that the level of support we're going to get from the province is likely going down with the delay and reduction in the LGFF framework. That's the replacement for the MSI funding. So in light of some recent announcements, we're proposing to put another $250,000 away to support the capital program. The residual $624,000, almost $625,000, we're recommending go to the asset replacement and rehabilitation reserve. Similar to above, the first $250,000 of that is to replace the reserve contribution reduction we did at budget time. So to replace that that reduction to get the reserve back to the balance that we thought it would be. And then finally, the residual would go to that reserve to support asset management requirements and the ongoing needs we have in that area. So prior to these allocations, just for reference, the tax stabilization reserve had an ending balance of about 4.1 million. The general capital reserve was about 5.1 million, and the asset rehab and replacement reserve was at 9.9.
Sorry, say that last bit again. The three.
Sure.
reserve-
So before these allocations, the ending balances in those reserves. So tax stabilization is at about 4.1 million. General capital is at 5.1. And the asset replacement rehab reserve is at 9.9.
And sorry to interrupt, but can you just, so the tax stabilization reserve is at 4.1 at the end of 2020. That's
Just to clarify, these are the projected balances at the end of 2021. So
I should have clarified that.
These are the balances including everything that's committed
Okay.
this year and budgeted this year versus the actual
Right.
at the end of 2020.
Yeah.
Great. That
Sorry.
helps clear up my confusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Irwin. Yeah, before we've done these allocations, but the projections based on everything up till this point through the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
So on a related note, normally I don't always speak to the alternatives identified in the written reports. This time I felt it was crucial to do so since we have been talking about this lately. One alternative we did explore but are not recommending is to allocate a portion of this surplus to a new dedicated reserve for the 10% cost share of potential future disaster recovery program claims. Having trouble with my words there. So as council may recall, or finance committee, I should say, at the most recent, I believe it was a COW meeting, there were discussions on the changes to the disaster recovery program that now includes a municipal cost share portion that did not previously exist for 10%. Based on the initial communications we've received, they're recommending that municipalities set up a dedicated reserve for that potential future cost share should we need to access the DRP funding. But this was a very recent pronouncement, so we're not recommending implementing this at this time. Further analysis on our side is likely required of our insurance program and what this means. I was on a webinar yesterday. I believe AUMA is also doing some advocacy in this area to understand this recent change. So given that it's come up very recently, we're planning to do further analysis before we potentially implement this recommendation. Why we're comfortable with this also because we're in the very fortunate position that we do have healthy reserve balances, as I was just speaking to with the on the last slide. So our general capital reserve does have a stated purpose that includes capital expenditures necessary in cases of emergency. And while it's difficult to predict in the future how much we might need to access through the disaster recovery program and what that 10% might be of, if we look to the last time we did need to access that funding for the 2013 flood, we received about $15 million. So if this cost share had been in place at that time, our portion of it would have been 1.5 million. And so with a balance of 5 million in the general capital reserve and other healthy reserve balances, we're not recommending creating a dedicated reserve for this at this time until that analysis has been required, given we have other means we could access in the short term should we have a disaster in the very immediate term. So the recommendation then for,
Can I question, Your Worship?
Go ahead.
Ms. Richardson, it's my understanding from the CAO that we actually aren't forced to pay that 10%, that's completely optional. So that's another bit of analysis that you might want to do when you guys are moving forward with sort of researching the implications of this. Is that's my understanding that that 10% is not necessarily for the municipality to have to pay. It's if they want to pay it.
Ms. DeSoto.
Yes, I would just like to add some clarity there, Councillor McCallum. When you and I were talking or exchanging emails, I believe there might be some misunderstanding of my position there. So
Oh.
we would be responsible for the 10% of the costs that were related to town infrastructure damages,
Okay,
but we would not be responsible for 10% of the costs for private property. So that private property damage would be the responsibility of the private property owner. But any damage to municipal infrastructure, like we saw on pathways and water mains and roadways, we would incur those costs, and the 10% would be the town's responsibility.
okay, my apologies, I misunderstood your communication. Very much for clarifying.
Thanks.
Ms. Rogers, you had something to add?
Thank you. Yeah, just one thing to add, and just as a reminder that this 90-10% refers to any uninsurable losses. So first responsibility that we have is to insure anything that is insurable, and then the DRP funding would cover 90% of any uninsurable losses within some parameters, and 10% would be the responsibility of the town for town assets, as Ms. DeSoto spoke to.
Right, thank you. I'm just chuckling. I just noticed that Ms. Richardson's identified as Councillor Richardson. That's
Oh,
kind of
I'm not
fun.
sure where that came from.
Something
That
you'd like to
tip
tell
in your
us?
hand, you're going to take a run at it?
I don't even know how to change that.
it.
There we go. Thank
So
you,
back to
whoever
your
helped me out there in the
presentation.
background.
Back to your presentation then. Oh, Councillor Comfort has a question.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah, you
Yeah.
can. So I just wondered, is there any way of determining, like pegging a figure to what that 10% might be that the town would be responsible for in the future with this DRP change?
It would really depend on the nature of the event and what, as Ms. Rogers spoke to, our uninsurable loss on that event would be. So in the absence of any other benchmark to look to, I did look back to the 2013 flood where we accessed that 15 million and used 10% of that as the best guess we could possibly make is based on our prior history. But in the absence of that, it would depend on, again, the nature of the event and how much loss, and again, the uninsurable loss the town would incur, and it would be 10% of that.
I just wondered if you'd be able to put like a placeholder there of some kind that would not necessarily be accurate, but give us some kind of a benchmark or like that.
And again, if I was to, if council did, or finance committee, I should say, both in one day confuses me sometimes, but if finance committee chose to change the surplus allocation recommendation to include that recommendation, 1.5 million might be a reasonable place to start. But again, that would just be based on history. It wouldn't necessarily be indicative of what we would ultimately experience. And hopefully we never need to access
Never will. Yeah.
that again, but we do know there is a chance. So again, that's where I'm hoping that in the days to come, there might be further information released from some neighboring communities, from the AUMA, from other organizations to see what their approach is, what kind of amounts they're looking at, and that might help inform a recommendation we bring forward at a later time.
So more
Ms.
information
Rogers?
to come.
Yes,
Hopefully.
I was just going to speak to that as well. More information to come. I attended the same session as Ms. Richardson yesterday with AUMA, and they really did say the first step is to get real clarity on determining exposure through real understanding of what our insurable and uninsurable assets are. And then to further dig into that, which they will provide some direction on in the coming months about really how to assess risk of those particular uninsurable assets to start to form this approach to what this type of a reserve might need to look like. It just really is quite early days as the province really did just announce this change as part of the budget with not a lot of information. So.
Yeah, it does seem premature to be starting to plan in that detail. And who knows, the government may change their mind. They seem to be doing that. Yeah, sorry. So Ms. Richardson, did you have any other questions, Councillor Comfort? No. Ms. Richardson, back to you.
So that really concludes my presentation for the first agenda item on the 2020 financial results. So I know I went through that all quite quickly, but if there's any questions from anyone that they missed the chance to throughout or that they'd like to address now, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, that was all I had for the first agenda item, and the only recommendation is regarding the surplus allocation.
Thank you. I do have a question around the tax stabilization reserve, and I'm quite likely to support the recommendations, but just for certainty, the target for that reserve is 7% of the annual operating expenditures. So what's that translate out into in dollars? 7% of the.
Not sure if my friend Mr. Irwin has that sheet up in the background. Otherwise, I can try to pull it up here quite quickly. If memory serves, I think we were actually over that target.
I think, is it about 55 million? I'm looking at the summary of all units, actual, so total expenditures was 55. Is that the number that would be relevant?
I believe so. I see Mr. Irwin came here, so he might have the exact number.
The maximum target was 3.4, I think I have here. 3.2 of tax stabilization. So yeah, we're a little bit over.
Okay, so in the chart, it indicates that the target or optimum level is 7% of the annual operating expenditures. So you're saying that translates to 3.2 million?
Yep.
And we intentionally exceeded that, knowing that we were going to have the additional COVID expenses that were going to be paid through
Right, yeah.
in the short term. And Ms. DeSoto, I'm not sure if you had anything to add to that as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add, Mayor Borman, if you're looking at our total budget of 55 million, there are some expenditure lines that are transfers to reserves, and yeah, so it would be minus all of those transfers to reserves.
Sure. Great.
I just pulled the number that we had during the budget package, so it might be off
Right.
$100,000, but it's pretty close.
So the point is that the reserve is certainly at the target level, if not optimum, with this transfer. And we certainly learn. Yeah.
Have to remember what is kind of planned out of that money too is some of the RCMP and fire going forward in 22-23. So that has been earmarked out of that amount we're quoting right now.
Right. Well, we certainly learned last year how important that tax stabilization reserve is to the community, or can be. I'm looking to see if there's questions from other councillors for Ms. Richardson at this time. I see none. So that you've completed your intended report, correct?
Correct.
Great. There's no further questions for Ms. Richardson before we get into the motions. Okay, in which case I'll move that the Finance Committee approve allocating the 2020 operating surplus of $1,321,770 through transfers to reserves as follows: $197,000 to the tax stabilization reserve, $500,000 to the general capital reserve, and $624,770 to the asset replacement and rehabilitation reserve. And I'll speak in support of this motion. We, as has been noted, there was discussion recently when we were talking about budget for this year around the opportunity to reduce tax demand this year by depending on these excess funds to top up the reserves. So that was the intent of council. I think with the value of the tax stabilization reserve has clearly been identified through this past year. And it's worth noting that the general capital reserve is available for a number of purposes. And wanting to increase the asset replacement and rehabilitation reserve, partly because that's good policy and partly in anticipation of any possible changes to the DRP. So I think these are all good recommendations for the transfer, and I'll support the motion. Other discussion on the motion, Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Mayor Berman, and I too will be prepared to support the recommendations as presented. This is, again, I guess the final piece of our entire budgeting cycle. We have approved the 2021 budget, and now we're looking at what comes out of the 2020 budget and how that feeds. We had the privilege of being able to see that prior to setting the rate, or prior to setting the budget rather, for 2021, and it really gave us a real holistic look at what our finances are going to be. The most funding was definitely very helpful in the fact that we've been able to bank much of that for future uncertainty is, I think, a very prudent and valuable exercise. So I'll be happy to support the recommendations as presented, and really want to thank my colleagues, because we had to work through this quite a bit to determine on how we were going to set the tax rate, for being patient and working through this process. Thank you.
For the discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call a question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Going to move on to item D2, although Councillor Hillstead reminded me that I missed the approval of the minutes of the April 20th meeting. I'll put that motion forward after D2, since we're on a roll here. So item D2, the 2020 capital project summary. And Ms. Richardson, you're speaking to that as well.
Correct. So this one should be relatively short and sweet. So I don't necessarily have a presentation on this agenda item, but I wanted to provide this opportunity for any questions on any. So included in this agenda item was the summary of all capital projects completed last year, a list of all the projects that were carried forward into this year, into 2021, including the funding, and those project by project detailed closeout sheets. So just one reminder, any WIP projects that were in progress as of any WIPed projects referred to their status as of December 31st, 2020. And since we're now in May, the project status could have changed for some of them between that point in time and now. But again, if there's any questions on any of those capital projects, myself and the rest of administration can attempt to address any questions the Finance Committee may have.
Thanks very much. I just have a couple of questions about the closeout sheets. Let's see a closeout sheet number on this one, but the capital project number 7082, active transportation. It notes in that in the neither the CCC nor the FAC have been issued yet. Is it normal to consider the project closed prior to getting those certifications?
Yes, typically there's a transition period. Oh, sorry, I didn't take my screensaver off.
Go ahead.
Typically there's a period between the completion of the project and then the town's assumption of responsibility for that asset. And that just really makes sure that the asset is operating as intended and meets our performance standards. It's usually 2 or 3 years. I'd have to look into it specifically here.
Okay,
It's a
Great.
common practice.
thank you. Just want to understand that. Similar question on project 7159, which is the purchase of the New Life Christian Center lands. And in the notes, it indicates that the land sale and transfer occurred in the spring of 2020. The final title removing the NLCC mortgage was received. It feels like there's some words missing there. Or is that meant to be full stop after the mortgage was received?
I prepared that, and I think there's a couple of words missing. And really what I was trying to say there is that the land sale and transfer occurred last spring, but there was still an old mortgage attached to that title. And so we had to work with the land owner or land seller, I guess, and their bank to get that mortgage removed. And that was just completed in April of this year. So that's why the project, I guess, took so long. Was just dealing with that final piece on title. Yeah.
Right. So there's no loose ends hanging around on that project.
Nope, it's all done. Yeah.
And sorry, my apologies if it got cut off the way it printed, that we can't see it
Yeah,
all.
that's,
I'm sure I did it wrong. So yeah.
you can both do your mea culpas later. Okay. I don't have any other questions in regards to the capital project summaries. I don't know if other members of council do. Any other questions at all from Ms. Richardson or other members of admin? Seeing none, thanks very much for preparing this report. And with that, I'll move the Finance Committee accept the 2020 capital project summaries as presented. And I'll speak in support of that motion. This is always a pretty straightforward report to receive every year, and no surprises. Actually, it's pretty interesting to read through the closeout sheets and remind yourself of how much has actually been accomplished at the town of Canmore, particularly through what's been a difficult year. So always interesting reading, but I'm quite happy to support the motion. Is there further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll go. Councillor Comfort, do you have a question? Oh, I'll go back to item C1 before we adjourn and look into the minutes of the April 20th, 2021 finance meeting. Are there any errors or omissions in those minutes? Seeing none, I move they be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I believe that brings us to the end of this meeting of the Finance Committee. I'll move that the Finance Committee be adjourned. Those in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned.